By the time the situation began to feel wrong, no one could point to a single mistake. There was no failed assault, no obvious defeat, no clear moment when things collapsed. Instead, there was silence and time. At first, everything looked normal. British units were in position, spread across ground they had already fought hard to secure. Communication lines were open, reports were coming in. Nothing suggested an immediate crisis. On paper, the plan was still valid. But on the ground, something felt off. Men waited. Officers checked their watches. Radios crackled, then went quiet again. The expectation was simple. Orders would come soon. They always did. As the hours passed, the waiting became heavier. Not dramatic, just uncomfortable. Patrols reported small movements ahead, nothing confirmed. A few signs that the enemy might be pulling back or repositioning. No one was sure. This was the kind of moment where command mattered most. British doctrine placed strong emphasis on coordination. Units were not meant to act alone. Initiative existed, but only within limits. The assumption was that higher command had a broader view, that somewhere someone saw the whole picture. So the decision was made to wait. By this stage of the war, experience should have suggested caution. Delays had cost ground before. Time had proven to be an enemy of its own, but waiting still felt safer than moving without authorization. In reports later, this pause would sound reasonable. At the time, it felt different. Soldiers noticed it first. The quiet didn't feel natural. The absence of pressure didn't mean safety. It meant uncertainty. The kind that makes every sound sharper and every minute longer. Some officers began to ask the same question, without saying it out loud. What if the orders don't come? By early 1944, in Western Europe, the battlefield was changing faster than command structures could always follow. Radio delays were common. Messages were misunderstood. Priorities shifted without warning. Still, doctrine held. So the units stayed where they were. They held their lines. They waited. And with every passing hour, the situation ahead slowly changed. Without them. By the time a response finally came, it was no longer a choice between acting or waiting. The moment that required a decision had already passed. What British command would later learn did not come from a single report or inquiry. It came from what happened next, when waiting stopped being neutral and started having consequences. What made the situation even harder was that nothing looked urgent at first glance. No explosions, no broken lines, no panicked radio calls. From a distance, it appeared controlled. British command had been trained to recognize chaos, and this wasn't it. What they were facing was something far more subtle, a battlefield that was slowly shifting without announcing itself. Information arrived in fragments. One patrol noticed unusual movement. Another reported silence where activity was expected. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they suggested something was changing, but not fast enough to trigger immediate action. The problem was timing. Every report was already behind the moment it described. By the time observations reached command, they reflected a situation that no longer existed. What seemed accurate on paper felt uncertain on the ground. Officers hesitated to escalate incomplete information. Acting on assumptions could be dangerous. Waiting for confirmation felt safer, at least on record. But safety on paper does not always translate to safety in reality. As hours passed, the sense of unease deepened. Soldiers began to adjust their behavior instinctively. They spoke less, watched more, prepared without being told to. No one said it out loud, but many were thinking the same thing. If nothing is happening, Why does it feel like something already has? This was the quiet phase of the mistake, the moment before consequences became visible, the point where delay still looked reasonable and restraint still felt like discipline. By the time the atmosphere fully changed, the opportunity to act early was already slipping away. At some point, waiting stopped being a temporary state and quietly turned into a decision of its own. Not an order written down, not a command spoken aloud, just a choice made by doing nothing. From headquarters, the situation still appeared manageable. Reports showed stable positions, no major enemy breakthroughs, no clear signs of collapse. In that context, holding ground felt responsible. But the battlefield doesn't stay still while paperwork catches up. Forward units began to notice changes that were hard to quantify. Tracks where there hadn't been any before, small movements at night, distant sounds that didn't match earlier patterns. None of it was enough to justify acting alone, not according to procedure. Officers faced a familiar dilemma. Acting without orders could lead to chaos. Waiting could lead to something worse. The system they trusted was designed to prevent rash decisions, but it was slower than the situation unfolding ahead of them. Time kept moving. Enemy forces were not idle. They adjusted quietly, using the pause to reposition, reinforce, and prepare. What looked like calm was, in reality, preparation happening just out of sight. By the time updated intelligence reached British command, it was already outdated. Messages passed through several levels before reaching the front. Each step softened urgency. What began as uncertainty became no immediate threat. What should have been a warning turned into reassurance. This was not incompetence. It was structure. British command relied on coordination, hierarchy, and confirmation. Those strengths had won battles before. But here, they created a delay that no one could fully see while it was happening. On the ground, tension built quietly. Soldiers prepared without being told to. Weapons were checked more often. Positions were reinforced informally. Everyone sensed that something was coming. They just didn't know when or from where. Then, when orders finally arrived, they were careful, measured, conservative, too careful. They reflected the situation as it had been hours earlier, not what it had become. Units were told to hold, to wait for further clarification, to avoid unnecessary engagement. By then, the enemy had already completed their move. The first contact did not come as a surprise attack. It came as pressure, gradual, controlled, and deliberate. British units realized almost immediately that the ground ahead was no longer what they thought it was. Positions that had seemed safe were suddenly exposed. Routes that should have been clear were covered. The opportunity to move freely was gone, and only then did it become clear what waiting had cost. Not defeat, not yet, but initiative. British command would later describe this phase as a failure to exploit the moment. Those on the ground remembered it differently. They remembered standing still while the situation changed. They remembered trusting that silence meant stability. And they remembered the exact moment they understood that the absence of orders had become the most important factor of all. Looking back, British command would later describe this moment as understandable caution, and on paper, it was. No commander wants to move without clarity. No officer wants to be responsible for an unnecessary clash. The chain of command exists for a reason, to prevent chaos, panic, and fragmentation. But the battlefield doesn't respect process. What British units experienced was the danger of waiting for certainty in a situation that never intended to provide it. The enemy did not announce their intentions. They did not rush. They simply used the pause. Each minute of hesitation allowed opposing forces to settle into better positions. Each hour without movement reduced British flexibility, not because of a single dramatic event, but because options quietly disappeared. When pressure finally increased, it did so unevenly. Some units felt it first, others noticed it later. Coordination became harder as conditions diverged across the line. The orders that arrived afterward were not wrong. They were just late. They reflected caution rather than urgency, control rather than adaptation. By the time command recognized the shift, the enemy had already shaped the engagement. This wasn't a collapse. It wasn't a rout. It was something more frustrating. A realization that the moment to act freely had passed. Not because of a mistake in judgment, but because judgment had been postponed too long. For the soldiers involved, the lesson was simple and harsh. Waiting felt safe, until it wasn't. By the time British command fully understood what had happened, the situation no longer allowed for simple corrections. The enemy had not launched a sudden attack. There was no single moment that could be pointed to and labeled as the mistake. Instead, the problem revealed itself gradually, through restricted movement, limited visibility, and a growing lack of initiative. Units that had waited for orders now found themselves reacting rather than deciding. On the ground, soldiers noticed the change before it was acknowledged at higher levels. Routes that had seemed open hours earlier were no longer safe. Areas assumed to be quiet suddenly felt watched. Movements required more caution, more coordination, more time. Every adjustment came with friction. Commanders began issuing clearer instructions, but those orders arrived into a battlefield that had already shifted. What was once a flexible situation now demanded precision, and precision is hardest to achieve under pressure. The irony was impossible to ignore. The delay meant to prevent unnecessary risk had created a different kind of danger: loss of control over tempo. British forces were no longer setting the pace. They were responding to it. Communication became more careful, more deliberate. Radios carried fewer assumptions and more warnings. Language shifted from confidence to caution. Proceed if possible. Hold position until confirmed. Advance only with support. These were sensible orders, just no longer decisive ones. The enemy had used the waiting period exactly as intended, not to overwhelm, but to narrow options, to shape the environment so that every move carried weight. For British officers, this was a difficult realization. Doctrine emphasized coordination, patience, and discipline. All of those qualities were present. What was missing was timing, and timing, once lost, does not reset. As the engagement continued, British units adapted. They held ground. They adjusted formations. They avoided collapse. This was not a failure of courage or competence. It was a lesson. A lesson that waiting for perfect clarity can quietly surrender initiative. That orders delayed can still arrive, but arrive into a world that has already changed. In reports written later, the language remained measured. No dramatic blame, no sweeping accusations, just careful phrasing and restrained conclusions. But among those who were there, the understanding was sharper. They had waited for orders that never came, and when action finally followed, it came on the enemy's terms. Not because the decision was wrong, but because it came too late.